glad to have you here. So we're going to do something which is, I hope will be fun for you. We brought out of our collection in the museum. You've had a chance, some of you, to spend a little time in the collection, and we thought it would be fun to bring some things out of the collection for you to look up in person and also on video. So we brought out some documents and also videos for us to talk about. Sorry, it's got this, Albert, there's a little feedback, sorry. To look at two companies, Intel and Apple, and how they've pivoted on their way to success. I want to introduce myself again. I think Jeff introduced me, but let me introduce you to my colleague, Doug Fairbairn. So Doug got his master's degree in EE in engineering at Stanford, and then he worked at Xerox PARC, which is a very well-known leading innovative research center here, and in fact, he is in the exhibit because of his work there. He's a serial entrepreneur. He started 3 startups. You can see the different industries that he's been in. And then he's been at the Computer History Museum since 2007. And so it's really I love working with Doug. And for the Exponential Center, he's the director for all of our oral history program, which is focusing on collecting oral histories from entrepreneurs as well as VCs. So this is the tale of 2 startups. We thought it would be fun to look at together. Intel and Apple from the very beginning. Who started them and how and why? How did the funding go? And then look at how they suffered sort of their midlife crisis and they needed to pivot. What was the environment that caused that? What were their options? What did they end up choosing? And then what's happened since then and where are they today? What can we learn from both of them? So Doug's going to jump in with Intel.
So, can everybody hear me? Am I on? Okay. So, first one we're going to focus on is Intel. Intel actually got its start in 1968, but I think it's important to understand what the roots of that were. There were 2 people, Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce. They got PhDs. They were very smart guys, working in different parts of the country, didn't know each other, but they were brought together by William Shockley, the Nobel Prize winner for the invention of the transistor in 1956. And Shockley was an incredible recruiter. He identified some of the very brightest people to work at his new semiconductor company here in Mountain View. Just a few miles from here is where this building was. In fact, this building was only knocked down about 6 months ago. And so he brought a number of people together, but for today's story, we're going to talk about Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore. As good of a recruiter was, an identifier of talent that William Shockley was, he was equally poor as a manager. And in 1957, 8 of the employees had been talking with one another, and they said, "We've had enough. We can't take it. We can't work for this guy." And they walked out on the same day. And they liked working together. They just didn't like working for Bill Shockley. So they said, well, we want to form our own company or go to work for another company where we'll be loved and cherished and where we can do the important work that we are doing. Remember, this is in the very earliest days of semiconductors. Lots of people hadn't even heard about it. There were some East Coast startup companies starting to build them. Texas Instruments had started. But we were in the very early days of realizing the potential of what semiconductors could do. So these guys finally got connected with an East Coast financier named Arthur Rock. And he was able to, after a lot of work, line up $1.5 million of financing to form a company, Fairchild Semiconductor, which is actually, at the time, a subsidiary of Fairchild Camera and Instrument. And so they went to work together in 1957, and they didn't understand at the time, but they were, in fact, if you will, the Adam and Eve of Silicon Valley and of this technology revolution that we are experiencing today. Because although a lot of important things had happened in Silicon Valley before Shockley and before Fairchild, it was the advent of Fairchild Semiconductor and the development of critical semiconductor technology, and specifically the integrated circuit, which took place here, again, in Mountain View, that really lit the fire and has caused the explosion of technology and so forth that we are familiar with today. And in fact, we call Fairchild the $1 trillion startups because even today you can trace the DNA, if you will, of today's leading companies back to the founders of Fairchild. But the ones we're talking about today are two of them, Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore, who 10 years after founding Fairchild said, well, gee, this is interesting, but we think we can do better on our own, so we're going to go start our own company. And they called it Intel, for Integrated Electronics. That's how clever they were. And so I want to show you a little video. This video captures Gordon Moore, just a couple of years ago, recorded here at the museum with the other fellow, Arthur Rock. He was the one that arranged the financing of Fairchild. He also helped them raise the financing for Intel. So we're going to hear Arthur Rock and Gordon Moore talking in an interview here at the museum a couple of years ago. Gordon's in his 80s, Arthur Rock is in his 90s.
Do you remember that conversation?
I do indeed.
Can you talk about it?
This is Arthur Rock.
Well, it wasn't much of a conversation. Bob called me and said they wanted to do it, and I said, I'm in.
Bob Noyce says, I want to start a company. He says,
It
okay.
had to have been the easiest financing of a startup, I think, that has occurred in Silicon Valley.
So talk about how that happened, Arthur. From that moment when you talked to Bob, what were the next steps?
Well, I asked them, how much money do you need? And $2.5 million. How much are you willing to invest? $250,000. And then we talked about what percent of the company should go to the investors, and figured that out. And it was done within 10 or 15 minutes.
Were you surprised, Gordon, at how short an amount of time it took to raise the money for Intel?
Not especially. I knew Arthur was someone who could make a decision in a hurry, and he did.
How quickly did things move after this initial conversation?
Well, this was the days before electronic communication. So it took me about a day and a half to call the people I thought would be interested and get yeses.
Did you, Arthur, at that point have a concept of what would make a great entrepreneur? Did you understand what it was about Bob and Gordon that really had a chance to make this go?
Well, they made Fairchild Semiconductor go, so didn't take a great leap of faith to think they could do it again and not make whatever mistakes they did make at Fairchild.
Were you talking to Gordon and Bob about this specific opportunity that they saw?
No.
Did that come later?
Well, in the 15-minute or whatever conversation, they told me what they wanted to do, and I said, gee, that sounds great.
There was a famous one-page proposal, wasn't there, that was drafted to explain what the nature of the business?
It was 3 pages, double-spaced, and I wrote it so that some of the investors wanted to have something in their files. So I wrote this 3-page, double-spaced memo. It didn't say anything.
Oh, I didn't realize you'd written it. I thought Bob did.
No, I did.
Oh, okay.
I think Bob would have been more specific.
Probably.
So 50 years later, Gordon found out where the business plan had originally come from. Now, this is where history gets a little murky, because Arthur Rock was very clear that there was a 3-page business plan. The 1-page business plan that was referred to was actually, I think you have a copy of, and it was a typewritten, double-spaced thing, but it's it's got a lot of typos in it and so forth. It didn't have word processors, but this is it. So all people, the only business plan that anybody knows of today is the 1-page and barely a page business plan. Arthur Rock seems to think there was a 3-page one that he wrote, but history is confused. We don't know what happened to the 3rd page, or the other 2 pages, if there was such a thing.
But where it is consistent, Arthur said it didn't say much. If you read this, it doesn't say anything.
Yeah,
right?
It doesn't say anything.
A lot less specific, I'm sure, than any of yours. So in contrast, let's look at Apple. So remember that the founders of Intel, highly educated, proven entrepreneurs had already built a company, and it took them 15 minutes to get, commitment for $2.5 million. So in contrast, we have Steve and Steve, very bright but unproven. You've probably read some of the documents. Some of the people that they went to early on said things like, I don't know if I want to meet with them. They don't have shoes on and they smell, right? So young students, neither was a college graduate actually, neither had any business background, but Jobs certainly had the passion and the vision, and was this incredible engineer who loved tinkering, and he comes to the museum often. Actually, he was just here a couple weeks ago at an event that we had. And you can see, did any of you see his signed first computer downstairs? Make sure you don't miss that. You can see the Apple II with his signature was across the top. So in 1978, they had their first computer board, and that's a picture of it there, what it looks like. You can see his name written across the top. Totally bootstrapped. They were just kind of tinkering and figuring things out. They were part of this community called the Homebrew Club, where the hobbyists would bring and put together kits or show off, what they were building. It was clear that they needed somebody who was more experienced, and that they weren't really going to go anywhere in terms of actual shipping or scaling products or getting funding. And so Mike Markkula was brought in. He had this shared vision. He had been part of Fairchild, and so he was the one who wrote the business plan. And you have in there this idea. I love this organizational chart. You can see that Mike, who wrote this is what it looks like. This is from the original Apple business plan, which is in our collection. Mike called out for him to be the VP of marketing, and the VP of operations was one Stephen P. Jobs, and was the VP of R&D. And in the successive description of them, and it says how much experience they have, and very much in contrast to the Intel people, it says Stephen P. Jobs, 2.5 years of college. That's all that was listed for him. So their funding came from actually their personal connections, back, a lot of them to Fairchild. Don Valentine, who had been at Fairchild, Hank Smith. We have actually 2 business plans, the original, and this is the one that was given to Venrock and presented to Venrock. And then you already have met Arthur Rock. So we thought it'd be fun for you to hear the voices of these founders. And first, we'll hear from Mike Markkula, the adult supervision, and how he got involved with Steve and Steve.
Met them in the garage.
This again was an interview held here at the museum a short time ago.
Done and what he was working on, and I went, uh-oh. And so to me, it was a no-brainer. I was way ahead of it. When I saw what Boz had done, sitting there in that garage using an ordinary home TV, and he had color graphics even, and BASIC and ROM. So my plan was to encourage them, and I told them I'd help them write a business plan, and if the business plan was any good, I'd try to help them raise some money, because I knew a few venture capitalists, It was Steve that was supposed to do the business plan.
Yeah.
And I said, fine. I forget what schedule we committed to some evenings. So we spent quite a bit of time. And then I would give Steve the list of things that he needed to do, and then come back with what it done. And he never would do that. Huh. It was pretty obvious that neither one of them had any interest in writing a business plan. They just didn't want to do it. So I finally said, well, okay, I'll write a business plan, because I really wanted to see this thing go. And in the process of doing that, I came to the conclusion that we could build a Fortune 500 company in less than 5 years. And I thought, that would be really fun.
Yeah.
It had never been done before.
So a great view of this person who came in, had a clear sense of the business possibilities, and made the specific plan to help these founders. What about Steve Jobs? This is a very early talk that he gave, rare footage, that's part of our collection, where he's talking about his vision of where computing is and the relationship of people with where he thought computing would go.
It may be hard to relate to, the late 70s and early 80s when personal computers were not common and most people didn't know what you were going to do with them or why they would be useful. So keep that in mind.
The key area we're focusing on is the following. Right now, if you buy a computer system and you want to solve one of your problems, we immediately throw a big problem right in the middle of you and your problem, which is learning how to use the computer. Right? Substantial problem to overcome. Once you overcome that, it's a phenomenal tool. But there is a barrier of having to overcome that problem. What we're trying to do, and I think there's a reasonable chance that Apple's going to make a real contribution to solving this problem in the next 36 months, is to remove that barrier so that someone can buy a computer system that knows nothing about it and directly attack their problem without learning how to program the computer. And the reason I think that Apple's got a chance of solving that problem versus a lot of other computer companies that we all know of that are much, much larger than we are now, although we're catching up, is that our whole company, our whole philosophical base is founded on one principle. And that one principle is that there's something very special and very historically different that takes place when you have one computer and one person. Very different than if you have 10 people in one computer.
So very early had this concept, one person, one computer, a personal computer, and not only a one-to-one.
Do you remember that conversation?
Not only one-to-one, but also it wouldn't require technical expertise. Up until that point, people really had to be able to type in a lot of kind of command and control things to be able to get that going. So we've just shared with you just a snapshot, and you have a couple documents. We would love to kind of hear your thoughts. If you look at these companies and dial back about how each of them got funded and the how important were the business plans. Two really different styles. One very detailed, what was the path for them to get financing? Any thoughts? Great comment. Thank you. Other thought, perspective, please. Absolutely. That was what was common between these two cases, right? Different approaches and business models, but both of them, it was absolutely critical. Their personal connections for people that proved important for funding as well as for building the business. Please. Yeah, that's really key, and it's the other direction also. It's so important as an entrepreneur to screen where you're getting your money. You're going to be working with that person very closely, or they'll have sort of power over you. People who are funding are not just giving money, right? They will be your mentors. They're the people who can open the door for matchmaking, and in fact, those things prove far more important over time, usually, than the money alone. Well, let's continue here, and kind of Doug's going to talk about, let's fast forward and see how Intel evolved from that original business plan.
So I think the point here is that both of these companies, on into their business plan, if you will, face some significant challenges. And this will inevitably happen to any startup, any business. especially in this technology sphere where things happen so quickly. So if you read if you listen to the interview earlier that we showed you, Gordon Moore was very clear that they were starting a memory company. That's what he thought was the sweet spot in semiconductors. And right now we know Intel is a microprocessor company. They didn't know what a microprocessor was at the time. It hadn't been invented yet. It wasn't on their radar. It wasn't on their plan. But so they started out doing memories, and they came out with an industry-leading product for 1,000-bit memory, and that started to gain a significant foothold in the computer world. Almost simultaneously and by accident, a customer came to them with a design problem which they turned into the first microprocessor. It was accidental. It was not their plan. It was not in the business plan. Didn't have any idea that that thing existed. But within a year or two of the creation of the first memory, they were designing microprocessors. They weren't the first, by the way, but they were the first to realize the potential. 10 years on, as the memories got denser and denser, several Japanese companies had jumped into the fray and in fact were dominating. By 1980s, early 1980s, the Japanese companies had the lion's share of the business, and the industry overall, the DRAM industry, was losing $3 billion a year. And they were saying, well, we started to be a memory company, but we don't see how we can continue to be a memory company. We're doing microprocessors, but they're profitable, but oh, so much smaller. So what do? They can stay in the business, increase the investment in DRAMs, try to stay competitive. They can exit microprocessors. They can split the company in two. They exit DRAMs. They got to do something. But clearly, this part of their business, which is the main foundation of their business, was failing. And so what, in fact, they did, sorry, they took a very painful decision. And the way they came to it was thinking, well, if we were fired, if the board fired us, and somebody came in to manage the company, what would they do? And if they could get out of the mindset that they were a memory company and just get into the idea that we've got to save the company, they had to get out of the DRAM business, the memory business. So they closed their several fabs. They laid off 7,000 people. This is a very painful decision for a group of entrepreneurs. And they focused on the profitable business, which was microprocessors and a newer kind of memory called non-volatile memory. But it's symptomatic of, you get in your mind about what your company is, and when that is no longer working, it can be very difficult to change and to make the jump to a different strategy.
Today, Apple is known to be highly valuable, but there was a time when money was running out and they were close to bankruptcy. But before that, there was this product evolution where they were very much focused on the Apple II, the original product. It was selling well, expanding its market share. Small, though, as Steve said, but it's expanding. They added the Macintosh, which really revolutionized this concept of what personal computing could be. But, of course, Steve left. There was these challenges of poor management and lack of product focus. The existing products were growing modestly, and competitors were outstripping them in both sales and pace of growth. And there was a time when there was just literally 90 days of cash left. And so they thought maybe we should sell ourselves to IBM or to Sun, some of the other competitors. Steve came back. Came back in 1996 and made, again, difficult decision. What business are we in? What can we do? What's our core competence? Does that need to stay the same? Should it change? And made difficult decision to slash product lines as well as a lot of jobs and to focus really on this industrial design and the Mac. So how are they going to restart growth at this point? Sell the company, as we said, raise more money, reorganize, downsize, move into new markets. Was a fateful decision. We had Tony Fadell here last night for an exponential event. It's one time that he was in the Valley. He was here from Paris speaking. and talked about how he had come from Philips and literally was just answered a call from Steve Jobs saying, we want to move into consumer products. Will you come help build this device? What came out to be the iPod. And from that platform idea came the phone, that maybe we could take a computer and then make it talk. So in your packet, you have actually the announcement of Apple and concept that it had, that this was going to be a major time. And Apple reinvents the phone with the iPhone. Very famous time that Steve Jobs took the stage and said, we have 3 products together, right? The phone, computing, and music together. During this time of growth, they cleaned up their financials, changed the inventory. It is also really critical that this was a period of time when they really built out sort of the genius of the company in supply chain management and extensive partnering, and built the partners across Asia, primarily in Taiwan and then in China. And then this whole new family of Macs and building out this personal devices that led to computing in your pocket. So on our quick run through, where are they now?
Back to Intel. So Intel had spectacular success. Their decision to get out of DRAMs was a tremendous boon, if you will. They refocused their resources on the microprocessor. But even that would not have been such a great win if a critical decision by IBM to adopt one of their microprocessors as the core of the IBM PC had not taken place. With the combination of IBM's adoption of the microprocessor, of the Intel's microprocessor, and there were other competitive devices at the time, along with the fact that it became an open platform that everybody else could make clones of, generated huge demand for microprocessors. And Intel became totally focused on serving the PC market. And that became their new reason for being, is selling microprocessors into the personal computer market. But today, personal computers are not the thing, so to speak. I mean, we have them, but they're so powerful we typically don't replace them at the rate that we used to. It used to be every year or two you couldn't wait to get rid of your PC and get the new one. I've had mine. This one's 5 years old, and I can't convince myself that there's a reason to change at this point. So I'm just an example of the problem, if you will. Meanwhile, this thing called the web and the cloud have taken off, and people like Apple and Google and Facebook and others are building these huge data centers. And so Intel has a new growth market selling microprocessors into these huge data centers. And that's a good part of their business, about 25% of their business rather than individuals. But this market is flat. This is still not as big. They're into all sorts of other new technologies. They're even, I don't know if those of you here watched the Super Bowl, there was Lady Gaga, had a halftime show, and there was a light show with the above her head, actually flying above her head. Those were Intel drones being coordinated into a pattern of the U.S. flag or other things. So Intel has a piece of their business, a way to grow their business, is actually creating not only individual drones, but how to fly up to 500 drones at a time that are synchronized to create patterns in the sky. And so that's just one example of how widely dispersed, widely reaching Intel is in trying to restart their growth. As you can see up here, even going back to 1910, 1911, they're still making, generating a lot of revenue, making good profit. But in Silicon Valley, it's all about growth. It's all about, what are you going to do for me tomorrow? And Intel has struggled to rekindle that growth. And so this is just some of the examples of the problems that they face.
So what about Apple today? iPhone has driven Apple's revenues now 60%, more than 60% of the revenues for Apple come from iPhone. But we know where they are today. Are you waiting for your iPhone 8 or iPhone Special Edition, whatever it's going to be called? There's been a slowdown in purchases, not only in the United States, but in China and some of the other markets that they're looking for. Hot competitors in China, Xiaomi and others have shown that other companies have Moxie that can bring competitive products. So revenue was down for 2016. The last quarter results that just came out about a week ago show that they've bumped up again, but maybe it's short-lived in terms of the key drivers there. The kind of bright spot, of course, that came with iPhone and iPod were the services and the App Store. Those continue to increase, and maybe you saw yesterday an announcement that they're tinkering with the whole experience with retail and trying to keep people once they're in the ecosystem by delivering greater and greater services. So now, I don't know if any of you saw this, in addition to the Genius bar for people that need help, technical help, they actually have a whole design service. People can go and learn how to use their devices for photography or for design, and so free classes for that. So they're trying to kind of add the value-added services and keep people, once they're tight into the ecosystem, that will lead to increased hardware purchases as well as increasing services. What's beyond the smartphone? Watch has been disappointing in terms of sales. Other kinds of things in health, the car, and others. A lot of people are experimenting, but it's a very crowded market. Yesterday we were saying that there are over 200 autonomous car startups just in this area alone. So a very, very crowded market. And will Apple be able to show any kind of real advantage in that? To be seen. So is it time to pivot again? What's going to be next for Apple? Interestingly, even a time of declining revenues last year, R&D increased. Huge amount of cash on hand, but you can see that R&D went up $2 billion this past year. So the struggle to look for kind of new areas of product development is continuing. So now we'd love to get you into this conversation in the time that we have. We've kind of done a quick fly-through of two companies, very different kind of genesis, but both had similar or midlife crises and again are facing a time of increased competition and declined position relative to competitive. So what strikes you and what lessons can you pull out that might be relevant for you? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think Clayton Christensen is well known for the innovator's dilemma, this challenge that comes from, and Doug talked about this with Intel, you have so much investment in your successful areas of business that it's very tempting to just stay in that and try to wring out all the value that you can in your sunk investment in the areas that you lead, and difficult to make the hard decision to kind of shift and be able to compete against low-cost people that are kind of nipping at your heels. So those kind of decisions are difficult. Okay, I think actually for Apple, this has been one of their areas of key strength. If you look at the partnerships over time with, I think Foxconn is probably, or Honhai as it's called in Taiwan, is the most famous, but Pegtron, PCH are other key partners with them. They started with relatively lower value added and over time have really become an important co-partners in this, what some people have people have talked about, sort of this parallel process innovation. And it makes it possible for Apple to not only be able to have innovation incrementally over time, rapidly, but also to have very small inventory. And I think both pieces of that have been absolutely important for Apple's competitive position. So far this strategy that Apple has sort of designed in California, made wherever, has paid off. The value added is unprecedented, right? You have, for example, in a phone that might cost $700, the actual, if you look at the teardown of the actual component costs, Apple is getting at least 40% profit for their role as basically a design and orchestrator and marketer. So I actually don't think, in my view, I don't think the relationships with the manufacturing being distributed has led to weakness for Apple.
Yeah, in the case of Intel, Intel's strength has been the fact that it has been a leader in manufacturing itself. But today, when building a fabrication facility for a new technology of chips might cost $10–20 billion, more than building a car factory or something, anything else. It adds to the complexity of what do we do next, because building it is one thing, and then you got to fill it, you got to make it pay off, and so the investments in chip fabrication are now being made by countries in China and elsewhere, for example, and so Intel's manufacturing strategy, I'm sure, is one of the key elements, for them to focus on. But to date, it has been a tremendous advantage and key advantage, because their competitors could not match their position in that space. Even though others may be able to design a chip, they couldn't manufacture it with the capabilities that Intel can. But I'm sure that's under scrutiny now because of the huge investments associated with staying in that business.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think one of the key takeaways for me is the interesting part about Apple. On multiple occasions, they were down to, or maybe on multiple occasions, I don't know if you mentioned it, multiple occasions, they were down to like 90 days of cash stuff, right? And I think one of the things, creativity loves constraints. And that was a huge constraint at that life point in Apple's future. And they had to be very creative about what do we do. And so for the entrepreneurs that are here, I think during those times, it's easy to get down on yourself and realize that maybe just die and go away. But the true entrepreneurs are able to, during those times, be creative, and actually, some of the greatest opportunity comes out of those moments where, you're in a weak state, but you're positive, you go forward, and you're looking to where you can take that.
I think that's absolutely the case. There are so many examples of being constrained actually forces you to create an amazing product. I mean, Steve Wozniak will tell you that one of the reasons why the computer that he designed was so cost effective was that he didn't have very much money, and so he had to make it with a few parts. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about Tony's comments about that last night? Tony Fadell was, as Marguerite said, was here last night, and he was really the force behind the iPod and a major player in the iPhone. But before those successes, he had a long series of failures. And he was asked, what did you learn from those failures? And it was, very much, one of the major points that he made was make sure that you're solving a current, real customer problem now. In some of his early failures, they were solving problems that the customers didn't have any clue about yet. They hadn't gotten to that point. They were, in his words, 15 years ahead of time. The problems that they foresaw were not ones customers were going to experience for another 15 years. And so that became a very core part of his understanding, his belief, is solve a current customer problem.
On the other hand, Steve Jobs is well known for talking about that customers can't even envision some of the ways that they're going to be able to use their devices. So you need that combination. One of the really interesting parts of last night's conversation was about this dynamic. When you have these constraints, how do you actually iterate? How do you make the hard decisions about what's going to move forward and what are you going to leave behind? And in the case of iPhone, Steve Jobs made the decision to have two senior level vice presidents pitted against each other in competing projects. Tony Fadell was tasked with taking the iPod, and he actually tried to see if he could take a click wheel that came from Bang & Olufsen a phone, put that together with the iPod idea and put it on a phone. And the other person, Scott Forstall, he was a software person, and he was the one who was saying we're going to shrink down the software and make it basically without any kind of mechanical device. We're going to and no stylus. So he was the one that was testing what became the multi-touch screen, and they were competing and in parallel. And so they talked about this kind of like A/B testing now, but really be ahead of their time in iterating very quickly. He showed this styrofoam model that he built in what did he say, six days, and then had all of the guts of it working. So that rapid a time that they were both iterating. So I think we're just, if my clock is right, out of time. So if any of you have questions, Doug and I are here, but I hope that we've, like all of the parts of the museum, we hope we've kind of teed up some interesting questions that have been provocative for your thoughts as you are entrepreneurs and thinking about how you're building and growing and pivoting. Hope we've introduced you to two of the iconic companies that are here, giving you a sneak peek into some unique parts of our collection, and you have some materials if you want to read more to take home. So thank you again.
I'm just going to make a couple of comments before you wrap up. Is that in both of those cases where Apple and Intel had faced crisis situation, they were solved by sort of strong, clear, focused, top-down message from management. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it, and it really takes strong leadership to do that. Relative to on a completely different topic, relative to Marguerite's earlier comment about sort of solving the customer problem, but Steve Jobs saying, well, you can't ask him, and both of those things I think go together. Sometimes customers may have a problem that you can solve, but they cannot explain to you what the solution is. So it's up to you to recognize the problem and recognize the opportunity, and to innovate and come up with a solution that they and all your competitors haven't thought of yet. So it's absolutely true. You can't go out and take a survey and people said, I need a personal computer. That wasn't the first thing that came to their mind if you asked them. But if you recognize the opportunity that they had the problem today that you could solve in a unique way, then you really have something.
Great. All right, thank you, and enjoy your day.